Let's talk briefly about the image tag, the IMG tag, which is nice because it is clearly the word image and stands for image. I think you've probably worked with images before, and as you're going to see me harp on again and again, the critical thing about images, as with links, is the idea of paths. The place you're most likely to get messed up inside an image is paths. And again, we have absolute and relative paths, and the reason I'm harping on these paths, the relative and absolute paths, is because it's going to come up again in HTML, and it's also an incredibly useful concept for you to understand in general, this idea of paths. So the path to the file that you want the browser to find and display is in the src attribute. src stands for source. It's the source of the image. Why didn't they call it href? They probably should have called it href, because that's what it really is. It's a hypertext reference, or maybe URL or something like that, right? Something that designates that it's a file path. Actually, I would love it if they just standardized on the word path, and anytime you needed a path, like in an A tag would have a path, an image tag would have a path, and that would tell you very clearly that what you need to put in that attribute is a path. And then you'd know that you could use an absolute or a relative path. And that probably, if your image wasn't displaying, it's because you got the path or the file name wrong. Okay, so that's the source attribute. Then there's two attributes in images that are kind of a pain, and I never really have gotten the entire straight story on them, and so I'll give you the story that I know about these two attributes and how I tend to use them. They're the alt attribute and the title attribute. Back in the beginning, titles were almost always ignored in HTML. Many tags have a title attribute, but nothing happened with the title attribute. Whereas the alt attribute was established very early on, because when, for example, in a picture, you have a browser, and believe it or not, there were browsers that didn't support images early on, or more importantly these days, if you have a vision impaired implementation of a browser, or someone who's using the browser is vision impaired and they have a reader, there has to be something for them to read because they can't see the image. The alt tag really traditionally was used as the tag that specified what you want the user to see if they can't see the image, or what you want them to have, what text you want them to have if they couldn't see the image. That was the alt tag. And the title tag was early on pretty much ignored, and it was there, but it wasn't really used for anything. Well, somewhere along the line, someone decided that it was actually the title tag that was the standard bearer of the name of what's in the image, and that you could just display whatever was in the title tag, and that would be sufficient for the alternative text, the alt tag. And so we have sort of a confusion between the title tag and the alt tag. It's changed, the usage has changed over time. I believe the standard usage is now always include a title attribute, and the alt attribute is optional, because browsers will take what's in the title attribute and display it in that little tooltip. You know what I'm talking about. When you mouse over an image, you get a little piece of text that gives you some indication of what the image is. That's also often used for disability applications, where if you're vision impaired, it will speak to you what's in the image. So that's the alt and the title tag. I'm sorry if it's a little confusing. I'm a little confused about it. I think that that actually the usage of it has changed over time. There's no doubt some page somewhere that will tell you what the current standard is for the use of those two tags. Okay, so those are the ones that you really need to know about. The source tag, which names the image, gives you the path to the image, and the alt/title tag, which allows you to put a tooltip or some sort of alternative text for the image. And then there's a few other attributes that you ought to know about, because they'll pop up. And all of these can be specified, and usually are specified these days, in CSS rather than being typed directly into the tag. Just an aside, because I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but it's an important and interesting concept, is that in the early days before there was CSS, the only way you could format a tag was by attributes. So you might have a height and a width attribute, specifying the height and the width of the image, and you type them directly into the tag. Well, when CSS came along, it kind of it encompassed all of those attributes that had already been created, heights and widths, etc., and then added a tremendous amount of other ones. So the amount of formatting you can do by just typing attributes into tags is limited. The amount of formatting you can do in CSS is unlimited. Still, those attributes live on and are often used. And so, yes, probably standard methodology is not to include all those, and sometimes you'll see, if you use Dreamweaver, for example, that you'll try to type in an attribute and it'll say that attribute has been deprecated, which means that we no longer like it, we no longer use it, something else is replacing it, yet it's still supported because of prior browsers. So that's the idea of formatting attributes instead of using CSS for formatting. So that's an aside. I'll introduce to you at least the idea of the height and width attribute, and those obviously set the heights and the widths. I won't go into detail about how do you set the heights and widths. You can do it by percentages, you can do it by pixels, there's other units of measurement, all of those ways that you can research more. Suffice it to say that the height and width are things you'll often see, and that by and large in this class I'll just use pixels to keep it straight. And a pixel literally is a point on the screen. Now, I could really go into this whole other digression about the different units of measurement and how they work, but I think I'll try to keep it simple here and just say in this course we'll generally use pixels. Only one other that I want you to be aware of, I think. Two more that I want you to be aware of, and one is the border attribute, and specifically the use of the default usually for an image is border equals 0, so there's no border around the image, except in one case. If that image happens to be inside an A tag, so it's a link, so you might create an image and you want people to be able to click on that image, and when they click on that image they go somewhere. If the image is inside that A tag, then the browser will by default, at least in the browsers that I've seen, put a border around it to designate it as clickable. And oftentimes you just don't want that border. You want that border to go away, so you set border to 0, and then that annoying border that comes up around your image only when it's inside an A tag will go away. So that's the use of the border attribute that I'd like you to know about. And then finally there's the align attribute, which in our terminology, which I think is a really good way to think of it, changes the image from an inline image to a block image. If I say align equals right, what that tells the browser is that I want the image on the right side of the computer screen, and I want it to be in its own grid. I want it to be in its own box position. And then the rest of the text that's around it will flow around it. But I want it to establish its own little grid element, its own little box there that image will be inside. So if I say align center, align right, align left, those are the ways that I do that. Now that's not the only way that I can put the image inside a block, but it's the only way that I can put an attribute on the image itself that will allow it to be in a block. If I don't put that attribute on, by the way, the image will just come up in line, which means if I put XYZ, then I put an image tag, then I put PQJ, it'll literally say XYZ, and then the very next thing next to the Z will be the image, and then the very next thing next to the image will be PQJ with no space, no border. It's as if it was in line. That's very convenient when I want to put a little picture, teeny little picture right in a paragraph, right? Then I can put a teeny little picture right in a paragraph. So that's the use of an image block or inline. Inline, I don't include the alt tag, I don't include the align tag, and block, I do include the align tag. Now, where I was going previously was that's not the only way to make an image come up in a block. For example, if I have a paragraph, a P tag, and the only thing in the P tag is an image tag, the P tag will create the block. The only thing in the paragraph is the image, so therefore the image appears on the screen as a block. I haven't made the image element into a block element. I've put it inside another element that's a block element, and there's nothing else inside it, so therefore the image takes on that block look. I can also do that with a div. If I put the image inside a div, since the div is a block element, automatically creates the rectangular space on the screen, then the image will be inside the div and everything will be okay. All right, so that's what you need to know about images. We're going to use images a lot. As I say, the path is always the hardest thing to understand, and then oftentimes with images, getting them to be the right size and getting them to be in the right place on the screen is kind of a tricky thing that you have to mess around with.